Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Patriot Underground. Today is Monday, June 7th, 2021, the year it's all going down. So thank you so much for joining me. Before we get into tonight's episode, which is, of course, part two of Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, and my discussion and analysis of that text, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to stop by and to listen. The channel is continuing to grow, and it's very, very exciting. I feel so blessed, and I feel so honored to be of service to my audience in the way that I am, and I really am inspired by all the feedback that I am continuing to get of all the people who are resonating with the message. So thank you so much. God bless each and every one of you. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, the last time we discussed the origins of this document. Okay, so if you haven't listened to part one, it's probably a good idea to do that because we covered not only the origins, we also covered the historical background and the political rationale the cabal lays out for declaring silent war against humanity. And we also analyzed how the elite discovered that if they could control energy, then they could control humanity. So we pick it up tonight on the next section entitled Descriptive Introduction of the Silent Weapon. Now, the elite tell us that the only difference between ordinary weapons, conventional weapons, and silent ones is in their manner of functioning. But their intention remains the same, and that silent weapons actually uses this metaphor, that silent weapons use computers and algorithms instead of guns and bullets. However, unlike a gun, it says, quote, it makes no obvious explosive noises, causes no obvious physical or mental injuries, and does not obviously interfere with anyone's daily social life, end quote. But beyond the obvious, or perhaps you might say beneath the surface, these silent weapons, they cause unmistakable noise, injury, and social interference to the trained eye. And the only trained eyes the cabal expected were their own. They brag about it. If they say the public can't, it says, quote, the public cannot comprehend this weapon and therefore cannot believe that they are being attacked and subdued by a weapon, end quote. Now, if you really stop and think about it, doesn't that quote describe exactly what the cabal has done to our society and our world? I mean, don't most people, when you try to explain to them the million different ways they're being targeted, don't they look at you like you're absolutely insane? Of course. And it's because they have no conception of the fact that they're under attack, that we're all under attack. They don't understand the weaponization of information, for example. And there are many different types of silent weapons we're going to talk about. But they don't understand the weaponization of information, and that's a big part of why we're here, isn't it? I mean, we're here to help understand for ourselves so that we can convey to others the concept of the silent weapon and how it operates, because ultimately those of us who are ahead of the curve are going to be tasked with that divine mission, I believe. Now, the next quote I'm going to read expands upon this idea. The cabal says, quote, the public might instinctively feel that something is wrong, but because of the technical nature of the silent weapon, they cannot express their feeling in a rational way or handle the problem with intelligence. Therefore, they do not know how to cry for help, and they do not know how to associate with others to defend themselves against it, end quote. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read this quote, it essentially sums up the journey, in my view, that all of us have been on since we first began to sense that something was profoundly wrong with the world. That's usually the first step in the awakening process. Before we knew that the power structure, the establishment was evil, we had an intuitive feeling that something just seemed off, but we couldn't put our finger on it. We struggled internally because we couldn't believe, at least initially, that the power structure upon which we had built Our entire worldview was false and evil. What a terrifying concept. And for most people, that's as far as they ever get, is disbelief. Because the enormity of the truth is just too vast and terrifying to comprehend and to accept. But what the cabal didn't count on back when they conceived and developed these silent weapons of war against us was the great awakening that would commence because of the action that they took against us, because of the deployment of these silent weapons. They never imagined not only that we would eventually cry out to our fellows for help, even when our families wouldn't listen, for help, for understanding, but also that we would organize against the enemy on a digital battlefield in defiance of their tyranny. And that's exactly what we've done. Collectively, we stand together to expose these silent weapons and unify as a species for our very survival. They never saw it coming in the same way that most of us never saw their plot against us coming either. But when evil floods the world, the Spirit of the Lord raises up a standard against it. And that's what we're doing and what we've done and what we'll continue to do. The enemy thought we were just going to roll over and die. You could read it in their own arrogant words. But that's not what happened. We didn't roll over. We rose to our feet and helped our wounded to do the same. And that's exactly what we're going to continue to do as this whole process unfolds. You see, that's the problem that the cabal has. Their blind spot is they completely underestimated the human spirit because they don't understand it. They don't understand our unshakable resolve to fight for our lives and for our freedom. Because freedom is the only thing that makes life worth living. They don't understand how deep that commitment is. Not just for Americans, but for freedom-loving people around the world. It's one of the only things that's really worth fighting for. But they have such a low opinion of us that they thought that they could turn us into sheep, and just fatten us up for the slaughter. But human beings don't back down when our backs are against the wall. We unite and we fight to defend our birthright, to the death if necessary, because we recognize that there are fates worse than death, like I alluded to a moment ago. And a prime example would be living as a slave, living on your knees to these evil monsters. I don't know about you, but I'd rather go down fighting. But the cabal certainly had a plan and executed it to near perfection because of the stealth of both the technology at their disposal and also the stealth of the incremental rollout of their arsenal of silent weaponry. It's very, very slow, very, very methodical, because they understood that in order to remain undetected, they would need to manipulate humanity's capacity to adapt to our circumstances very, very gradually. If they did anything too overt, that would get our attention. That would arouse our fighting spirit. So it was all about putting us to sleep, hypnotizing us, putting us in a trance, literally, so that they could get us to put our defenses down. And they could have their way with us because they control our mind. Now the text says, quote, when a silent weapon is applied gradually, the public adjusts/adapts to its presence and learns to tolerate its encroachment on their lives until the pressure, and then it says in parentheses, psychological via economic, becomes too great and they crack up. Therefore, the silent weapon is a type of biological warfare. It attacks the vitality, options, and mobility of the individuals of a society by knowing, understanding, manipulating, and attacking their sources of natural and social energy and their physical, mental, and emotional strengths and weaknesses. Man, that's cold-blooded. But you see, unfortunately for them, we didn't crack up. We woke up. And then we stood up. And then we decided no more. I'm certain that the history books of the future will attest to that. God is my witness. But the cabal, they have a total disdain for us. They think that we'll behave like total cowards, sheep under attack. But that's not who we are. The cabal's analysis of humanity is based solely on their ability to divide us. But it completely falls apart the moment we're united. That's why Trump says when Americans are united, we're completely unstoppable. He's absolutely right. And not just Americans, again, the people of the world. When we unite, it's game over. Because when that happens, the elite, they shake in fear, literally. And rightly so. They thought if they weakened us emotionally, psychologically, if they gradually broke us down, methodically wore us down in all these different categories, emotionally, psychologically, physically, that we would eventually submit. But the more they weakened us in those areas, the more we cried out to God for help. Not them. They wanted us to cry out to them, but we didn't. We cried out, we got down on our knees and we cried out to God. And because of that, God answered our prayers by strengthening our spirit in response to the enemy. And I believe that with every fiber in my body. And through that spiritual connection with our Creator, we were given the strength necessary to identify and combat the enemy. It's divine intervention. And the reason that the cabal doesn't understand this spiritual strength and this connection to God is because they hate God. And they love death. And they're empty inside. And so therefore, they can't understand anything about us. They can't understand really who we are at a spiritual level, our defense system. Much in the same way that, to be honest, most of us couldn't understand their weapons. Because it's difficult for God's people to comprehend pure evil. But the cabal gambled, and they bet against our spiritual strength. And I believe they've already lost. And the reason that they did this, the reason they gambled this way is because, again, they can't comprehend the passion of humanity. Our love for God, our love for justice. So we may have been blind to their attacks, but they were ignorant of the power of God's sleeping army of patriots all over the world, awakening, like Gene talked about. Now, in the next section of the text, it's called Theoretical Introduction, and it begins with a famous Meyer Rothschild quote. And this is the Rothschild that goes back to, I believe it's the 1800s, if I'm not mistaken. But this quote says, "Give me control over a nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws." Most of you have probably heard this before. Why is it such a famous quote? Well, it underscores, at least in my mind, both the economic conquest of the elite and the concept that financial dominance of a country renders its laws null and void to the cabal. I mean, we've seen so much evidence that they're above the law and that no justice ever comes to them that it enrages and insults our soul. I certainly don't need to point out examples of that to this audience. The Rothschild made a discovery that was very important to the development of this silent weaponry. So he discovered that the scientific principles of energy could be applied to economics for purposes of dominating the public. But his plans wouldn't come to fruition until the invention of the electronic computer in the 20th century. And we talked about that in part 1. But he discovered that potential energy, kinetic energy, And friction/resistance or energy dissipation could be applied to the principles of power, influence, and control if levied through economics. So put simply, the principle is, quote, and this is another Rothschild quote, when you assume the appearance of power, people soon give it to you, end quote. Now, in the field of economics, just like in the study of energy, there are three primary components that work together to produce an outcome. Put simply, the first one is economic capacitance, which is capital, money, stock, inventory, investments, and structures, etc. The second one is economic conductance, which would be goods and production flow. And the third would be economic inductance, which would be services. So Rothschild figured out how to scientifically game the economy by manipulating these three elements and essentially creating a weapon system, an economic weapon system to target us by making us dependent on the private central bank. So how did he do this? Well, here's a quote. Rothschild discovered that currency or deposit loan accounts had the required appearance of power that could be used to induce people. Again, inductance being the first of the three energy laws he applied to economics, to surrender their real wealth in exchange for a promise of greater wealth, end quote. And it's important to note that because the laws of quantum physics establish that everything is a form of energy, this economic inductance works in very much the same way as energy inductance, with people corresponding to a magnetic field. The promise of wealth acts as a magnetic force of energy, which then redirects the consciousness toward manifesting an illusion, created by them, of course, which is that we need their system to be fulfilled. To have better lives, we need them. That's the mindset they want to trap us in, and they did. And collectively, humanity bought into this scheme because of the overwhelming force of agreement amongst the people. The agreement of humanity to accept their system ultimately manifested the system itself, the Kabbal's vision, which is why it is so vitally important that we imagine and articulate a better world and harness our consciousness toward manifesting our dreams instead of their nightmares. That's a big part of what the Great Awakening is going to be all about. It's a big part of what Gene talks about quite a bit, as well as Simon Parkes. So Rothschild saw that people would put up real collateral in exchange for a loan of promissory notes, which were backed by nothing except the appearance of power, you see. And as long as Rothschild could entice people with the image of wealth, he found that he could issue more currency than he had backing for. These notes were loaned to banks and governments, which created overconfidence amongst investors. And so Rothschild would then spring his trap once he had his fangs into whatever organization borrowed from him. Because he controlled the money supply, he could make it suddenly scarce and then collect the collateral when investors could no longer meet their contractual obligations, and then continue to repeat the cycle ad infinitum toward world domination. Now, this financial upheaval and uncertainty is a form of pressurized energy that could then be manipulated to start wars. And Rothschild had so much control over this economic conductance that he could even determine the winner of a conflict. It says, quote, that government, which agreed to give him control of its economic system, got his support. Rothschild further refined his practices of war profiteering by providing economic aid to the enemies of his debtors, funding both sides. In essence, in order to ensure that collection would take place. But his fundamental discovery was that greed and fear, which are low vibrational frequencies, of course, would enable him to print money beyond its backing, what we call inflation. He could print money beyond its backing in precious metals or the production of goods and services. So in this economic structure, credit is masquerading as capital, when in fact it is negative capital. It's collective debt dressed up as an individual asset to perpetrate this greed-driven culture and mindset we were programmed with. And people get so caught up in their pursuit of an illusion that they abandon a sense of connection, a connection with their fellows, and a sense of responsibility for those around them. It's an alien mindset. We were never designed to operate this way, and yet here we are, all these generations later, fighting to free ourselves from this slave master who is invisible, but not for long. Now, the text makes it clear that this economic slavery system necessitates wars and genocide to balance out the inflation. Another reason for them to love war. It's very profitable. So the Cabal tells us, they say, quote, war is the balancing of the system by killing the true creditors. And then it says in parentheses, the public, which we have taught to exchange true value for inflated currency. And falling back on whatever is left of the resources and regeneration of those resources, end quote. That's their whole plan right there. Fund both sides, buy it all up, and do it all again. So to translate into more simple terms, this is their basic financial attack vector model. Step one, manipulate our greed and get us to surrender our real wealth in exchange for a loan, which they then make impossible to pay off because they control the money supply and the interest rates, of course. Step two, use this debt slavery to create a non-sustainable economic model which generates anger, fear, and uncertainty amongst the people and nations of the world. Step three, use the pressures of this dark energy, this lower vibrational frequency that I mentioned, to prompt wars, to kill off the creditors, the people who surrendered their real wealth. Meanwhile, the Cabal funds both sides to ensure both destruction of infrastructure as well as the collection of collateral. Step four, the Cabal buys up whatever property and resources are left for pennies on the dollar, and then the cycle repeats. That's what's been going on now. For how long? For generations, folks. Hundreds, if not thousands of years. Now, the next section is the one I think I'm going to stop on tonight. Let me take a look at I think the next one is going to be the final one I'm going to get into tonight. And it discusses how economic gaming experienced a major breakthrough after the invention of the computer, which I mentioned earlier. The electronic computer made it possible to discover the quote, psychoeconomic structure of the economy, end quote. And how did this come about? Well, the document talks about how aviation shock testing was going on around this time, and that they were able to apply aviation shock testing principles where the force of a projectile's recoil energy is monitored by vibration transducers, essentially. They were able to apply these same principles of aviation shock testing to the economy in the form of price shocking. Prices are shocked, and the public consumer reaction is monitored and analyzed and then gamed with algorithms, of course, using computers. Here's another quote for you. It says, the resulting echoes of the economic shock are interpreted theoretically by computers, and the psychoeconomic structure of the economy is discovered. And then the text goes on to say, quote, Then the response of the household to future shocks can be predicted and manipulated, and society becomes a well-regulated animal with its reins under the control of a sophisticated, computer-regulated social energy bookkeeping system. End quote. Well, that sounds like hell to me, doesn't it? It then goes even further to say, quote, eventually every individual element of the structure comes under computer control through a knowledge of personal preferences, i.e., universal product codes, UPC, barcodes, etc., with identified consumers. And of course, they did this by the use of credit cards and eventually branched out to more evolved forms. The one which the text describes says a permanent tattooed body number invisible under normal ambient illumination. So what that really means is that this economic system is all about social control. Gaming you by AI, learning your personality through social media, and ultimately branding you as an actual commodity, reminiscent, of course, of the mark of the beast. So in the summary section of this segment, the cabal makes it clear that, quote, since energy is the key to all activity on the face of the earth, it follows that in order to attain a monopoly of energy, raw materials, goods, and services, and to establish a world system of slave labor, it is necessary to have a first strike capacity in the field of economics. In order to maintain our position, it is necessary that we have an absolute first knowledge of the science of control over all economic factors and the first experience at engineering the world economy. In order to achieve such sovereignty, we must at least achieve this one end, that the public will not make either the logical or mathematical connection between economics and the other energy sciences and learn to apply such knowledge. That's why they keep advanced physics, quantum physics hidden. Then it continues, quote, this is becoming increasingly difficult to control because more and more businesses are making demands upon their computer programmers to create and apply mathematical models for the management of those businesses. It's only a matter of time before the new breed of private programmer/economists will catch on to the far-reaching implications of the work begun at Harvard in 1948. And of course, they're referring to the beginning of this silent war against us. The speed with which they can communicate their warning to the public will largely depend upon how effective we have been at controlling the media, subverting education, and keeping the public distracted with matters of no real importance. Let that sink in. All right, folks. Hopefully you enjoyed tonight's episode. Please let me know on Telegram. I'm very curious to hear your comments as always. And once again, please do everything you can to support the channel. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share it with like-minded people on social media. If you can make a small donation to support the platform, God bless. Thank you so much for giving me your consciousness tonight. I'll be back again, God willing, with another video. Until then, Patriot out.